From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the long-awaited release this week of President Trump's so-called Deal of the Century Middle East Peace Plan. President Trump rolled the plan out at the White House on Tuesday, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in attendance. The Palestinians, who've refused to deal with the administration since it recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital at the end of 2017, were not there and not invited. To discuss what the plan involves, how it's been received so far, and where things might go from here, I'm joined today by two great guests, Khaled Elgindy and Michael Koplow. Khaled's a senior fellow and the director of MEI's program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs. Michael's the policy director of the Israel Policy Forum. Khaled, Michael, thank you both for joining us today, and welcome to the podcast. The Trump administration's plan is around 180 pages long, I believe. Unlike the two of you, I suspect most of our listeners probably haven't gone through it in detail. So to start off with, Khaled, could you briefly lay out what you see as the kind of main points of the deal?
Yeah, we read it so that others wouldn't have to. In broad strokes, the plan calls for a Palestinian entity that would come into existence after 4 years. Of course, assuming that Palestinians are, once they agree to join the process, it would make up around 70% of the West Bank, which means that the remaining 30%, on which the vast majority of Israeli settlements sit, would be annexed to Israel. All Israeli settlers would remain, all settlements would remain, and ultimately be annexed by Israel. There would be some sort of land swap with areas in southern Israel and south of Hebron, south of the West Bank. But all of that is contingent, of course, not only on Palestinian acceptance, but on a whole list of conditions that Palestinians first have to meet, including things like disarming Hamas and so forth. So what it is basically is a state that is entirely surrounded by Israel, by Israeli territory. Israel would retain full security control over all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, including the so-called Palestinian state, would control the airspace, the electromagnetic sphere, the territorial waters, the entry and exit points. The state of Palestine would not have the ability to enter into treaties with other countries. So it's really a state in name only. The second, or I guess the other important issue is Jerusalem. Jerusalem would remain Israel's undivided capital. The Palestinians would be allowed to have a capital near Jerusalem, but most notably not in the city itself, which, of course, the United States has already recognized Israeli sovereignty in all of Jerusalem. On the issue of refugees, whereas previous American initiatives and peace proposals had at least talked about a symbolic number of Palestinian refugees that would be allowed to return, and then some other sort of compensation package and a menu of other options. The plan is quite explicit in ruling out any possibility of any Palestinian refugee returning. So all three of the issues that Palestinians care about most, a truly sovereign Palestinian state, a capital in East Jerusalem, some sort of just resolution to the refugee issue are basically off the table. It's really just a way to make the occupation permanent.
Michael, I'm curious, what were your main takeaways from looking over the report?
My assessment of it is similar to Khaled's. I don't think that there's any way to look at this plan, even though it is described as a two-state outcome, as a genuine two-state outcome. Certainly the state that it envisions for the Palestinians isn't a state by any metric that anybody is familiar with. I think that the biggest takeaway for me, aside from the details of the plan, are that this is a very clever way to allow Israel to begin annexing territories inside the West Bank and applying sovereignty to every single Jewish community in the West Bank outside of the context of a deal. And there have been mixed signals so far from the Trump administration as to when precisely that annexation process can begin. But there seems to be no disagreement on the fact that now that the Trump administration has put this conceptual map out there, that Israel can begin to annex some of the territory that the map envisions as part of the state of Israel at the end of this process, and whether the process actually ever works or not. And I suspect that at the end of the day, that is actually the true purpose of this plan. I'm sure there are some folks within the administration who think that there is a genuine chance that Palestinians may come around and look at this and decide that they're willing to negotiate. But I think that for others in the administration, the point of this is really to pave the way toward incorporation of settlements into Israel proper. And it's difficult at the moment to see how that process is not going to begin pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Michael and I usually have a lot more to disagree on in other contexts, but this time around, I think we're very much in agreement. I see annexation as almost inevitable. I think sometime between now and November, we're going to see some movement towards some formal kind of measure that's taken to consolidate what Netanyahu's given them. This is not a true peace plan in the sense that there's any hope that Palestinians will come to the table and the two sides will negotiate and have some long drawn-out negotiation process. This is presented to the Palestinians in quite unprecedented levels of detail as a fait accompli. So annexation is coming. It's just a matter of precisely when, but that window, I think, is pretty narrow. And at that point, I think the whole ball game changes. I think the conflict enters an entirely different phase, one in which the possibility of a two-state solution, even further down the road, even under a more moderate U.S. administration and a different Israeli government, I think looks very unlikely.
I agree entirely. And something I'd add to that is that whether you think that the U.S. has done a good job of this traditionally or not, and whether you think they've been unbiased in this or not, the United States has, at least in the past, acted as a mediator between the two parties, irrespective of whether it has favored one of those parties or not. In this instance, the United States isn't acting as a mediator. This is presented literally as a bilateral agreement between the United States and Israel, leaving the Palestinians out. And I think the consequences of that go even beyond whether a two-state solution will be possible post-annexation. I think that they really reset the role of the United States going forward, where no matter who is the president, depending on which party they're from, I suspect that the United States will now look much more as if it is imposing something on the two sides. And when you have a Republican in office, it will probably look closer to what we have seen from the Trump administration. And when you have a Democrat in office, it will probably look very different from what we've seen from the Trump administration. But I think that aside from the impact on two states, this is also going to impact the way that the United States itself operates in this arena going forward.
Moving on to the response to the plan so far, I'd like to kind of go through how different groups have responded to date. Khaled, starting with you and the Palestinians, President Abbas rejected the plan more or less immediately, saying it should be consigned to the dustbin of history. But I'm curious how you see things going forward, and almost if this was designed to be something that they couldn't possibly have accepted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine any Palestinian leadership, past, present, or future, that would be willing to sign on and to negotiate on this basis. It is almost a caricature of what the worst critic of an American-led peace process would argue. But it's not parody; it's real life. So it's sort of ludicrous on its face. And I think it will be impossible for Mahmoud Abbas, who's otherwise, I think, he's been pretty accommodating in the past, much more so than others in his leadership circle, and certainly more so than where the Palestinian public has been. So he's going to strike a defiant tone. He has very limited options in terms of what he can do politically. The Arab states have not really rallied to his side, with the possible exception of Jordan. Most Arab states, I think, are disinclined to fully embrace, but are saying things like, we appreciate President Trump's efforts and this initiative, trying to not be completely dismissive, but also without very clearly embracing it. Whereas what Abbas needs right now is some allies, and he's not really getting that. He will try to seek some sort of UN measure, get the General Assembly to condemn the plan and reiterate the traditional terms of reference on 242 and Palestinian state and Jerusalem as his capital and all of that. Not sure if he will succeed. He will also seek something from the Arab states. But right now, his options are pretty limited. And it's pretty clear that he does not have a clear strategy going forward for if he still buys into the idea of a two-state solution, how is he going to achieve that, not only when the Arabs have lost interest and Europe is distracted and the United States is actively working against that goal, but when your own internal house also is in a state of disarray in terms of Palestinian division. He's in a very unenviable position.
On the Israeli side of things, Michael, I know obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu said that annexation would be kind of imminent shortly after the plan came out. How do you see it more broadly within the Israeli political context in the run-up to the elections and kind of after that playing out?
Israelis are across the board pretty happy with this plan, I think for two reasons primarily. One is on security, the plan really takes anything that Israel could ever hope to ask for and grants it as to Israel as a concession. So, in previous rounds of negotiations and in previous iterations of Israeli security demands, plans have been weighted pretty heavily toward Israel. And I think that most people have expected that when you look at the core issues of the conflict, security is the one that Israel is always going to have the big advantage on in any plan. In this case, it really goes beyond anything, as I said, that Israel's ever had before. So on that note, Israelis are extremely thrilled with the security posture that they see operating in once this plan is implemented, if it's implemented. Second, on territory, for many Israelis, the settlements and the settlers are something that they don't see and don't have to deal with, but there is a very influential and loud minority in Israel that is a settler constituency. And again, this is the first time that anybody has come forward and said to the Israeli government, you don't have to evacuate one settlement and you don't have to uproot even one settler. So on that count, I think Israelis are looking at this and they're saying, this is wonderful. We have a green light from the United States to keep the biblical heartland in Judea and Samaria and maintain this connection to the West Bank. And it really doesn't, it's not going to cost anything or involve a trade-off. So Israelis are pretty happy. We've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu and Likud take this and say, let's immediately implement the territorial aspect of this. Let's go ahead and annex. Kachol Lavan, blue and white, which is led by Benny Gantz, so far has embraced the plan itself. Benny Gantz has said that on Sunday he wants to bring the plan in its entirety to the Knesset for a vote to approve it. He has said that he and his party are against any type of unilateral annexation in the context of the plan that isn't first coordinated with Jordan, with the Palestinians, with other regional states. It remains to be seen how long he will be able to maintain that position, given that the politics inside of Israel are such that it's difficult to argue when the White House is saying very publicly, it's fine with us if you guys go and start to annex territory. It's very difficult to be an Israeli and say, well, the U.S. wants it, but that's too much for me.
Let me ask Michael this question. Where is the Israeli public on the issue of annexation? You laid out where the kind of the political elites are, but where is the Israeli public? Are they indifferent? Are they not following the details that closely? Or
it's a really good question. So when you do polls of the Israeli public, what they say is by an overwhelming majority, their first choice is separation. But this is a scenario where they're being presented with a plan that says you can annex things and still achieve separation. You can annex 30 to 35% of the West Bank and then be separate from the Palestinians. And so for a lot of Israelis, they see that as not being a contradiction. Second, to the extent that Israelis support annexation as a first order option, it is almost always in the guise of maximum amount of territory with minimal amount of Palestinians. And in this case, this is an annexation scenario that gives them precisely that. Now, the caveat to this is that almost no Israelis understand what the actual downstream implications of annexation are in terms of Israel's security, in terms of what it will ultimately cost, in terms of maintaining Israel as Jewish and democratic, in terms of the reaction from the rest of the world. And so that kind of thing isn't priced into public opinion. And I think that for many Israelis who support it, it's a lot like Brexit. It's an easy slogan, sounds really nice. When some of the actual costs and details become more clear, I expect that people won't support it quite in the same numbers that they do now.
Will that have an impact on whether or when annexation happens, do you think? I know I'm asking you to predict the future, but
sadly, I think it probably won't. I think that a lot of these costs will become clear to Israelis after they have already implemented annexation of some sort.
We touched earlier on the reaction on the part of the Arab states and the international community, but I'm curious to focus on two other actors that may come into play here as well. One, the United States, and two, Europe. If one of you maybe wants to talk about what the response has been on the U.S. side, and then maybe we can talk about Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, we know where the United States is on this issue, at least officially, the administration. Obviously, there's a more nuanced picture as you work your way down, but I mean, the Europeans have been, I think, sort of torn between wanting to reaffirm very clearly a two-state solution and not wanting to run afoul of the Trump administration in general. They understand his temperament. He can be erratic. He can sort of lash out in unpredictable ways. So they've been so far treading, I think, a fine line. But in the meantime, my sense is that they're doing some real deep soul searching in terms of how do we definitively, if our goal is to salvage a two-state solution, not to mention a rules-based international order, which this plan is frankly a full frontal assault on, then we're going to have to come up with a bigger and more sort of concrete steps on how we're going to do that. I don't think that they're there yet. I haven't seen a full-throated response to this plan.
Khaled, do you think that is entirely because of the Trump effect, that they don't want to run afoul of a volatile guy? Do you think that if there was a different person in the Oval Office, the response from the Europeans would be qualitatively different?
I think it depends. I mean, you mean a different personality in the White House, but pursuing similar vision? It's possible. I mean, it's not exclusively because of his temperament. I think I think people still there's this remnant of the old world order where Europe looks to Washington for leadership, for kind of leading the charge, and they're still not accustomed to this new world order where the United States is disinclined to do that, and frankly, even under the previous administration, was increasingly less inclined to kind of pursue that kind of a role. So they're adapting to this whole new world that we're in. But I suspect, if anything, this administration gives them an opportunity to be much more clear. And so we'll have to see what sort of a response they're going to formulate. But I would expect one that comes out pretty strongly, if not against the plan, at least in favor of all the things that the plan is trying to undercut. The UN resolutions that have undergirded this process, 242 and Land for Peace, the basic principles of the 1967 line, the illegality of Israeli settlements, the need for a just resolution to the refugee problem. The legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership is another thing that people kind of forget about, but has been a direct target of this administration. At every turn, they have implied and said quite explicitly that this is not a legitimate Palestinian leadership. But we'll have to wait and see.
We're running a little bit short on time, but before we wrap up, I'd like to get both of your thoughts on kind of where you see things going from here. What are the kind of short-term, long-term implications of the deal? Starting with you, Michael.
So the March 2nd election in Israel is going to obviously weigh on this in terms of Israeli response. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to use this deal as his number one argument for winning the election. And Benny Gantz wants to make sure that this deal is not the key to Netanyahu's reelection. So it's definitely in Netanyahu's best interest to keep the discussion of annexation and immediate application of sovereignty in the public sphere as long as he can before the election. And so I think that we'll almost certainly see from the Israeli government and in coordination with the U.S. kind of a steady drip of progress, even though I hate to use that word in this context, progress on annexation. So, at some point there will be a cabinet vote, and then they'll debate in the Knesset, and then they'll announce they're forming the committee, the joint committee between the U.S. and Israel. And then a week later, they'll announce that they've made progress on maps. And I think that this will all keep on going up until March 2nd. I don't expect actual annexation to be implemented until after the election. And once that happens, and frankly, it's difficult to see how it doesn't. The only way in which it doesn't happen is if Gantz wins the election and somehow is able to put the brakes on this. It's out there. It's out there in the ether now, and you can't really pretend that it's not. And it's going to be difficult to walk back. And even if it doesn't happen now, I expect that this annexation conversation is going to be with us for a while. And once that happens, I don't see any way in which the rest of this deal or any components of it can be even negotiated on, let alone implemented.
Just a real quick follow-up question for Michael. Did Netanyahu get the sort of bump that he had hoped for in terms of, we all know that the timing was a little bit suspect just as he was about to be indicted. Is this helping him, or is this helping Gantz in this kind of election stalemate? And then maybe we could, if there's time, we could talk a little bit also about the broader U.S. Context.
So far, it looks like he's gotten a small bump with at least one of the two seats that he's up in polls coming from blue and white. I do expect, though, that because the farther Israeli right is opposed to this deal, because they don't want to give any legitimacy to a Palestinian state at all, that there's going to be a lot of back and forth where they are trying to take some of Likud's existing votes for themselves, people who are opposed to any type of Palestinian entity at all, while Netanyahu tries to then make that up by taking votes from Kachol Lavan. There is still a little less than 5 weeks to the election, so there's going to be a lot of maneuvering. But overall, I don't think this will hurt Netanyahu. He may tread water because of votes he loses to the right, but my guess is on balance it helps him.
Any thoughts, Khaled, on where you see things going from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's we didn't talk a lot about the broader response in the U.S. in terms of American politics, and that's where I think something interesting is happening. It's sort of odd to see Democratic presidential candidates and members of Congress, mostly Democrats or exclusively Democrats, take a harder position against this plan than Arab states. That's sort of odd in broad historical terms. But there has been, I think, some pretty vociferous opposition coming mainly from the left and progressives, that this is not a real two-state solution. And I think there's a fair amount of criticism coming from the analyst community as well. Many of my colleagues, I know very, very few of my colleagues in this business who are out there actively trying to promote this plan as somehow workable. There's a handful I can think of, but for the most part, most people kind of see it for what it is. And so that in a bizarre kind of paradoxical way has opened up space for debate on a range of issues related to Israel and Palestine that we haven't had in the past.
So I'm not sure how much this is going to be a paradigm shift in terms of debate opening, and how much of it is a direct reaction to President Trump and the fact that he is uniquely vilified by Democrats. We all saw an interesting confluence on a letter from a group of senators a couple of days ago, where You had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren sign on to a letter criticizing this agreement. And you also had Amy Klobuchar, which was an interesting name, just given the context of her past statements on Israel and her general positioning. And something like that, to me, looks like a direct reaction to the guy in the Oval Office and not necessarily to the wider policy issue. And I think that, at least in my conversations with a lot of Democrats, progressives absolutely are united in their conviction that this is a bad deal. But I see a lot of Democrats who are closer to the center who are trying to find a way to salvage something positive out of this. And I think that a lot of that is the legacy of Democrats still being pretty reluctant to shift too much on their views toward Israel.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Khaled, Michael, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you,
Michael.
Michael.
Thank you, Khaled.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.